Roguelikes are one of, if not my most favorite game genres out there. I find that pretty much regardless of what roguelike I play, there's a pretty high chance I'll enjoy it, and it's pretty reasonable to say that this is the case for many other roguelike fans as well. Roguelikes just have that appealing charm to them, with many providing an incredible gameplay experience to both consumers and critics alike. Now of course, that doesn't mean that all roguelikes are the absolute pinnacle of gaming. Several games in the genre have issues, and this can be the case for a variety of reasons. Maybe the game didn't have a creative and interesting premise, a flaw roguelikes can struggle with because of the constricting guidelines that need to be followed to make a roguelike. Or perhaps the game was lacking in a fun and rewarding combat system, another thing roguelikes can fall prey to. What I'm trying to say is, roguelikes aren't perfect, and there are a lot of reasons all the different games in the genre aren't perfect, as is the case in pretty much any other game genre out there. However, roguelikes are a special case, because there is one flaw of roguelikes that stands out above the rest. Not necessarily because of its massive impact on the roguelikes it affects, but rather because of the unusual consistency in which I see this fatal flaw. It's a constant looming presence that resides in the depths of roguelikes, and while its severity and impact varies from game to game, it's still always there, because a roguelike is conceptually impossible without it, and its name is repetitiveness. But of course, this goes much, much farther than just that singular word. So, let's break this down step by step and progress through the repeating realm of roguelikes. Before we can properly dissect the fatal flaw of roguelikes, we need to step back and examine the greatest strength of roguelikes, the same strength that is combated by its fatal flaw. Roguelikes are reputable for many things, but the one thing they have mastered as a genre, and arguably its greatest strength, is replayability. In just about every roguelike that exists, you progress through a series of challenges, areas, enemies, and bosses, collecting enhancing items, equipment, or some other equivalent until you reach your demise. You then upgrade your character or your weapons, unlock new things to find your successive runs, and replay the game from the beginning. Although this time you encounter a new randomly generated set of enemies, areas, items, and equipment, and maybe you make it a bit farther this time than you did last time before you die. This cycle then rinses and repeats until you get a run where you get to and defeat the final boss. And then you repeat the game, well, conceptually forever. There is no true end to a roguelike, as the final boss, or whatever the equivalent is in each specific game, isn't where you just finish playing the game, because often that takes a relatively short amount of time. If the final boss was where you put down the controller, roguelikes would take like 5 to 10 hours max to be done with. But obviously, those of you who have played roguelikes know that you can sink way more time into the games, and that's because of procedural generation. The final boss and the path there remains in most cases consistent in a roguelike. However, the rest of the game itself is inconsistent. Nearly every single aspect of a roguelike is often randomly generated on each and every run, including the map, items, enemies, mini-bosses, etc., creating a massive amount of new games possible in the overall game, each one with a new set of maps, items, enemies, and mini-bosses to fight and explore, along with some permanent progression to be had along the way. This is what lends roguelikes the mantle of strength and replayability, because it is one of the few genres in which the entire premise is you replay essentially the same, often offline game over and over again, while the procedural generation present allows you to get enjoyment from the repeating runs, as opposed to the game getting stale after so many loops. Now, I know, I just spent a whole minute praising the roguelike's greatest strength. What does that have to do with its greatest flaw? Well, the fatal flaw of roguelikes actually lies in the fault of their greatest strength and the overall goal of any roguelike, their good replayability, which has one massive fatal flaw: inevitable repetitiveness. Okay, I hear you saying, really? Repetitiveness, the one singular thing that the roguelike genre is practically designed to avoid? Yes. Let me explain. As stated, roguelike's greatest strength is their replayability. Every single roguelike you encounter sees you progressing through the same quote-unquote game in each run, and you do this many, many, many times, considering the average length of a run is about 30 minutes to an hour give or take. This, however, is where we hit a wall: repetitiveness. This looping of the same game over and over is bound to become repetitive at a point. I mean, you're doing the same 30-minute run over and over and over again, that eventually will feel redundant. Even the permanent progression in these games can't hold off repetitiveness for long on their own, as progression is great, but not when you just end up playing the same game from the beginning over and over and unlock a little bit of stuff every time, if that. Now, of course, this is where the procedural generation comes in, to combat this inevitable feeling of repetitiveness that comes with looping such a short run window tons of times over by providing new randomized content to keep players in. giving players a new run every single run with the new random items to get, enemies to fight, and places to explore for as long as they want to play for, kicking repetitiveness to the curb. Done deal, right? Well, not quite, because this system is flawed. Any roguelike obviously has a limited amount of content inside of it. None are infinitely large. That means that the content that is randomized is limited, which doesn't seem like much of a problem because the randomization should be able to take that limited content and exponentially increase it with randomization. But at the same time, there is a limited amount of things in a roguelike to randomize. So by that theory, eventually, you will get to a point where you begin to notice things repeating. You may get some different items and new enemies and a new layout every time, but eventually there will be general similarities that crop up. We humans are great at spotting patterns, and soon enough, you will see patterns and similarities in whatever roguelike you play, as these patterns are inevitable when a game has a limited amount of resources to randomize, and the goal of it is to consistently replay it in short intervals, which requires a game to have a lot of randomization in order to give a new run to the player every single time. Now again, I hear you saying, that's not really fair. I mean, every game eventually gets to that point of repetitiveness regardless of the genre, right? I mean, games aren't infinite, and of course with that comes pattern recognition or just a linear end. It just happens after a considerable enough amount of hours to leave players satisfied. Well, yes, you're right. Pretty much every single game out there will eventually struggle with repetitiveness. All games have a limited amount of resources and experiences they can give to a player. It just isn't possible to make an infinitely long campaign or an immeasurably large map to explore. Everything has an end at some point. So what about roguelike's repetitiveness makes that its fatal flaw, when other genres can struggle with it without it being a fatal flaw? Well, it's because the roguelike genre, unlike other genres, is exactly designed to not be repetitive and instead be replayable in order to function, and as such is held to a much higher bar of expectation in that realm. Other games and other genres obviously try to not be repetitive, but the roguelike genre makes it a distinct priority to not be repetitive, as that is a pitfall that can destroy any roguelike, no matter what it brings to the table. The genre is defined by repeating essentially the same game over and over again, and for that formula to work, the game has to not be repetitive, or else all the great creative gameplay in the world won't add up to much when you just keep getting that same loop of similar gameplay over and over and over again in short intervals. Other games can just have a long campaign that consistently provides new scripted content for the player to enjoy, which builds off itself in a linear fashion. Or an online versus system for players to interact with potential hundreds of thousands of new people every time they open the game. But roguelikes don't get that luxury. They must rely on their own procedural generation, the component which makes it not repetitive, to allow the player to replay the same short game over and over without it feeling like it's getting too repetitive, and thus creating a sense of monotony and boredom in the player, the two things you not want a player to feel when playing your game. Problem is, when your game is about looping that same game over and over again without being repetitive, and the biggest thing holding repetitiveness back is procedural generation, when you have an inevitable issue with procedural generation, which is seen in an unavoidable limited amount of content to randomize, it's nearly impossible to avoid that sense of repetitiveness at some point, which thus guarantees the biggest thing a roguelike is supposed to avoid, repetitiveness. Now the counter-argument to this is that roguelikes can just add enough content that the randomization is vast enough to remove a sense of repetitiveness for a very long time, which is a fair point. However, that's a tight line to walk. It is very easy to add too much content for the sake of longevity that the content feels bland, gratuitous, or too large in scope to create a coherent game with, which can end up being worse than having too little unique content. If you just cram in thousands of items and several hundreds of types of enemies with 100 playable characters and let the map completely change randomly in 3 dimensions every 5 minutes, sure, that will lead to more randomization, but then you have this garbled, confusing mess of so many items to learn and enemy patterns to fight and characters to understand and weird untraversable maps to cross, along with that potentially ruining any sense of a consistent and coherent combat system and gameplay balance. Also, that undertaking would be a very difficult thing for any dev, let alone an indie dev, to cram all in one package in a reasonable time frame. There just is an upper limit to exactly how much content can be put into a roguelike to be randomized, just like any other game minus the randomization. So, while yes, more content to randomize is good, there is a line to stay away from where too much is too much. But then again, at the same time, that smaller amount of content will give less to randomize and more quickly inevitably lead to a feeling of repetitiveness. As you can see, this one premise of repetitiveness is probably the hardest thing for roguelikes to work around, at least in my opinion. And that's because of how deeply rooted it is in the very concept of a roguelike itself. The premise of a roguelike and its supposed strength, or even reason at all for playing for some, is that expectation to have new runs to experience on every playthrough of the game. Something that is inevitably going to falter with a limited pool of things to randomize. And when that randomization is the flagship of the entire genre, its unavoidable faltering is easily noticed by players and can be inflated to the point that people just don't want to play them as long as they could, or even at all, even if they legitimately have a lot to offer. It's just a hard scenario to win in because of that inevitability of repetitiveness that has to be circumvented, boosted by the subjective nature of the bar the games are held to and its non-ending aspect. I mean, what should we expect as a standard for playtime for roguelikes, when the thing monitoring the standard is a feeling, repetitiveness? If the entire point of the genre is its replayability, how much playtime should the games have, as they have no end and should theoretically just keep being able to be played forever? I don't know myself, and I don't know if anyone knows, and that's what makes it so convoluted, and it all stems from that constant present source of repetitiveness. Now, after saying all of that, I do want to point out that many roguelikes, in my opinion, do well in falling on that optimal line of replayability, along with a moderated size of content and progression. Risk of Rain 2, The Binding of Isaac, Enter the Gungeon, and Hades, just to name a few, do great in my opinion. This theoretical infinity I've talked about is obviously entirely theoretical, and will be flawed. And of course, any flaw can be overanalyzed and spotted in any genre, but games just have some unavoidable flaws if they have them, if we're being honest. As long as the overall experience is enjoyable enough to push out those flaws that may be present, the game can still be amazing. And that's the same case for roguelikes as well, even if this flaw is a bit more unique in its widespread nature. There are many times when playing roguelikes that I feel a sense of repetitiveness, even in my favorites, but often the game does well enough in combating it with a solid enough system of looping, compelling story, creative gimmicks, and great gameplay that it isn't enough for me to just quit playing the game altogether. So don't take this as me saying a roguelike is always going to suffer immensely from repetitiveness and be unplayable immediately. Rather, it's more of a deep dive into the interesting complexity of this one singular flaw being always present and sometimes ruining roguelikes while being the very thing they strive to combat, considering the genre doesn't really have that many other flaws. So please, by all means, play roguelikes. They are great and many are an amazing experience, even if some are repetitive and conceptually finding themselves. When rereading this whole script, I reflect that it was probably unwarranted. I probably didn't back up my points coherently, there's probably holes in my arguments, I argued with myself constantly while writing this, I've rewritten this script like 4 times, I don't usually do this kind of a more comprehensive dive into roguelikes, which will lead to mistakes, etc. But I just thought it was so interesting that the roguelike genre's greatest strength and compelling gimmicks are countered by the very existence of themselves. It's like a diet soda being the solution to my sugar intake, but the absence of sugar in it just makes me want to get more of it from somewhere else, which defeats the purpose of the drink entirely, even though it did do its job. Now, roguelikes are obviously more convoluted than soda, and obviously they have managed to get around their inevitable repetitiveness, as many roguelikes have logged a lot of hours by a lot of people. But still, I thought it was an interesting, very long thought. But what do you think? Is the repetitive nature of roguelikes truly an inevitability that is visible in roguelikes? Or is the replayability of roguelikes enough to counter their potential feeling of repetitiveness for a substantial enough time to be considered non-important? Do roguelikes even feel repetitive at all to you? What else have I probably gotten wrong in this video? Please let me know in the comments, and say, if you want, you could replay this whole video again from the start to see if it itself is repetitive. Not at all for the algorithm boost, it's just a fun experiment. I'll even do the thing where I'll be exactly where I first was at the start of the video. Wait, that doesn't work, I have an end screen.